All right, here are some of my uh-oh moments when flying. And I'm really not sharing any of these just for like the sake of drama or trying to say, hey, look at me, look what I did. None of that. I'm really sharing it, I guess, for two reasons. One is that it makes me feel better just to like be honest and not have to beat myself up over it anymore, but realize like, hey, I made a mistake, let's learn from it. But then the second reason is that I hope that it helps other people to realize that, hey, Charlie's done that stuff too, or Charlie's done something really worse than I have. So there are 4 moments that stick out for me in particular, and I think there's really good lessons to be learned from each of those that I'll kind of mention after each brief story. So I will present these in increasing levels of uh-oh-ness, if you will. Maybe we can have like a little uh-oh scale here on the side of the screen. It's like, not too bad, and like, oh, I don't know, that was rough. I don't know, for the sake of not embarrassing myself too much, let's do away with that. My first uh-oh moment in an airplane actually happened on my very first solo cross country. Like, you're finally leaving the nest. Like, of all the times for something to go wrong, like that's a rough one. And so I'm going along and I'm kind of narrating to myself a lot, like my checklist, I'm saying it all out loud. Like I like talking to myself in the cockpit. I like talking in general, as you probably know. But I noticed at one point, all of a sudden I wasn't getting anything back in my headset. Like all my comms just went dark on me. And I just, all of a sudden my heart just started racing. I thought, man, did I just lose my radios and I'm out in the middle of nowhere? And so I started looking at my radio and realized, like, I saw the little receive, the little RX button saying, okay, I was receiving transmissions. And I tried to squelch it and turn the radio up, and I tried switching radios, and none of that was working. I thought, oh my gosh, this is like the first time I'm out here and everything's going wrong. And as I kind of just continued to work the problem and just try to think, like, I don't know, what else could be going on? Happened to glance down, my cord had just fallen out of the radio jack. It was as simple as that. Like, I had just stepped on it, and it was in a little 172 where the headphones jacks go up, so it's easy to step on and just pull them out. And I plugged it back in, and I was back on top, so to speak. And I just remember that like was pretty frightening for me for a second. But I will give myself a passing grade on that, because I think the lesson in this is to work the problem. When something goes wrong, you can't just say, okay, all is lost, we're doomed. I mean, as you know, and as we learn in training, you got to work the problem, and you have to try to stay calm. And it's impossible to stay perfectly calm, but looking back on that, I'm pretty proud of how I handled that. But there's some stories coming up that I'm not very proud of how I handled that. Second situation was a little bit more precarious, and it was when I was flying a Super Cub. And if you've ever flown a Super Cub or a tailwheel airplane for that matter, there's a kind of a delicate moment when you land. If you do a wheel landing, meaning you land on the front mains and you're waiting for the tail to settle, the moment between like that tail starting to settle and it actually being on the ground, you kind of don't have that much control, because you don't have a ton of air going over the rudder to really have some authority. But you can't like also use the brakes too much, because you're not like totally on the ground. You can't overuse the brakes and go nose over. And so it's this really delicate moment where getting an untimely wind gust could be difficult to control. And that's what happened to me. The tail was settling. It was a really, really gusty day. Probably should have been flying in the first place. It's another lesson I learned. And as the tail was settling, I got this really bad gust, and all of a sudden, before I knew it, I'm going off of the right side of the runway, and I see the runway lights, and I have to kind of dodge the runway lights. I mean, it just happened in an instant. All of a sudden, now I'm in the grass bouncing around, and I'm trying not to ground loop the thing. And then as the tail finally settled, I bury the stick back, in your seat and everything. Then I'm really getting on the brakes, and I come to a stop, and then the rudder's still spinning. I'm just looking around. I think, did anybody else see that? Like, that was really bad. And so the lesson in that is to keep flying the airplane. Man, until that engine is stopped, particularly in tail draggers, you got to keep flying the airplane. That's something my dad and I joke about. Like, the airplane isn't done flying until that propeller stops. And so you just have to stay in control. There's no point where you can just kind of relax and start focusing on other things. Like, when you're landing, man, it is all hands on deck. And so I treat every landing in the Super Cub as though, hey, if I don't do this right, we could be going off the runway. It's not as dramatic as that, but like, you get the point. You got to keep flying the airplane. I give myself a passing grade here, but only barely. The third uh-oh moment also happened in the Super Cub. Can you see kind of a trend building here? I was flying the Super Cub. I was flying with my cousin in the back it was over the holidays. It was a cold winter day in the Texas Hill Country, real high, tall, overcast skies. So it's kind of gloomy and dreary, but it's real stable. Great flying weather. I love those kinds of days. So we're flying low and slow over the hill country and have a nice flight, and we'd land, and I didn't get blown off the runway this time, thankfully, but made a good landing, except for as soon as my main tires touched down on the airstrip there in the back field, all of a sudden the propeller just stopped as soon as I touched down, and we're able to come to a full stop. But if you have any kids, have you ever watched some of those kids shows where it's a cartoon and they'll say, like, they'll ask a question and then they'll just stare and blink and like let you answer the question, like, oh, do you see any blueberries behind me? I think so. Anyways, I'll do that here. What do you think caused my engine to stop? Any guesses? It's carb heat, right? Like I had carburetor icing in this cold winter day flying in the Super Cub. And the lesson here is use the freaking checklist. Even if you're just in a joyride with your family in the back over the holidays and you're having a nice time, gotta use the checklist. I don't know how it just skipped my mind to not put in carburetor heat on a really cold day in the middle of the winter as I'm going in here to land. And so that was the reason the propeller stopped. And had it stopped any sooner, that would have been a real issue based on where we were flying. And so that, man, I look back on that is embarrassing, but use the checklist and don't forget the carb heat. I definitely give myself a failing grade on that one. And the biggest uh-oh moment that I've experienced in an airplane was in the mountains of Idaho. And I can say this was probably the only time, hopefully so far, that I've ever actually been truly scared or even afraid in the airplane, feeling like a passenger in my own cockpit. It really got my attention. It's a serious thing. I can talk about it now with some energy and maybe even some jokes and stuff, but it was a serious event and it really caught my attention. Luckily, nobody got hurt. Everything's okay. Didn't even resolve in a crash, but it definitely could have. And the gist of it was basically that I made a series of small compounding errors that led me into a really bad situation, what could have been a very bad situation. I started an approach way too high into Johnson Creek. It's probably one of the most iconic strips in Idaho, if not North America. I mean, just gorgeous. Started it way too high, trying to follow one of my buddies in. I didn't see the airport soon enough, and I was like, oh, no big deal. I'll just kind of drop altitude. And then there were some other airplanes coming into the pattern that I kind of wanted to try to stay out of their way. So I kind of made a short approach. I was still too high, made a short approach. Didn't give enough really respect to density altitude and what that would do on my ability to even slow the airplane down. And so I'm making a tight approach in the mountains at 10,000 foot elevation with density altitude of even higher than that. And I'm not really able to slow down. I got full flaps out. I'm slipping the airplane, trying to get into this thing, and I'm going really fast. And I realized, like, man, I didn't really have a go around plane here. I didn't brief the strip well enough to even know if I can go around or at what point can I no longer go around. I felt fully committed to this airstrip and I was going way too fast. I was going too high, and my buddy was at the end of the runway, and the airplane didn't want to land. I had to like force it onto the runway and really get on the brakes. And luckily I was able to stop, but I didn't know. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to stop in this thing, but I'm too scared to go around because I don't know what my go around procedure was. I mean, you're probably like shaking your head like, what are you doing, Charlie? But in the moment, I mean, each one of those errors didn't feel like a large commitment. Like, oh, I'm a little too fast. Yeah, I can commit to the next step. Oh, I need to make a little bit of a tight approach. Okay, I can commit to the next step. Before you know it, all of a sudden you look up and you go, how did I get here? But I got the airplane stopped, pulled over to the side, and I shut down, and I just put my head in my hands, and I thought, what did I just do? Like, I'm a very safe, conservative pilot. Maybe you don't think so after watching this video, but I'm only picking the selective times where I made stupid decisions, hopefully that we can learn from. Man, and it really freaked me out. And so in retrospect, like, I think the lesson here is this. Simply put, it's that I have learned firsthand that safety slips in small stages. There's not usually some catastrophic event or catastrophic decision you make. It's one decision after another where you decide to continue pressing on when you should have aborted the approach or the flight altogether far earlier than you did, and all of a sudden you end up in a situation you're not sure how to get out of. And I've read magazines and books and things of people making those types of decisions, and I thought, man, I will never do that. That just seems ignorant. But I've done it, and I can tell you, like, it can happen to you, and it's because safety slips in small stages. So I definitely give myself a failing grade on my performance in that one, but I think it's a really helpful thing to learn from. I'm really not saying, hey, look at me. I mean, it was a really scary situation for me, but really as a learning tool for myself, and then hopefully to help others avoid a similar situation. I put a full video about this event. I'll put the link up in the corner and down in the description. Really just as like I said, as a learning tool for me to say, okay, here's what I did. Here's kind of the pictures of what happened. And then looking back at each stage of the process, here's what I would have done differently. And those are the things that I plan to carry with me and implement in future flights up into Idaho. And I love flying up there. I'm wearing the vest right now of the Idaho Aviation Association. Great place to fly. You just have to really be careful. That day I wasn't careful enough. If you have a similar story, I really think that the best thing you can do is just share it with other people. You're going to be able to heal from it better and forgive yourself, but also encourage other people with it. So if you would you consider just leaving it down in the comments? Tell me what your uh-oh moments were. And I think it'll be helpful to scroll around and see what other people's moments were and how we can learn from it and how we can all encourage each other in the aviation community. So I look forward to reading through that. Thank you for your sincerity, and I'll see you down in the comments.